One of the first criminological theories to be developed in the United States, at least the first sociological theories of crime, was the Chicago School of Human Ecology. Human ecology, also sometimes called social ecology. So ecology is a term used in biology to describe the interrelationships of living organisms in their environment, how each affects and is affected by the other. Sociologists use the term social ecology to describe the interrelationship of human beings and their environment. So in this module, we are going to look at environmental theories of crime. The Chicago School emerged in the 1920s and 30s at the University of Chicago. And it derives from the European cartographic school. Cartographic meaning having to do with maps. So a French cartographer in the 1830s, a guy named André Gary, was the first person to really use mapping to try to understand the environmental relationships between crime and where people lived. So this Chicago School is the descendant of that initial attempt. Early social ecologists viewed the city, the urban environment, as a kind of superorganism with so-called natural areas, differentially adaptive for different ethnic groups. So you see the formulations of Little Italy and Chinatown and things like that. Shaw and McKay at the University of Chicago examined the Cook County juvenile court records. They managed to obtain these records from around 1900 to into the 1930s. And what they noticed was that the majority of delinquents came repeatedly from the same neighborhoods, regardless of the ethnic composition. What was happening during the early part of the 20th century is that this is the peak migration period. In the late 19th, early 20th century, you see peak migration into the United States. This is when the most people were coming into the U.S. In this time period, mostly from Europe, mostly from Southern Europe. And what Shaw and McKay noticed was that the same neighborhoods all were the high crime neighborhoods, no matter which ethnic group was living in those neighborhoods. So as one ethnic group would cycle in, another ethnic group would cycle out, and yet it seemed to be the same neighborhood that had the high crime. And they began to hypothesize that perhaps it was not characteristics of the ethnic group that caused the crime, but rather something to do with the neighborhood. Now, they did not say that neighborhood was the only cause of crime, but because human behavior is complex, social scientists usually try to single out a particular variable to look at a time, but we always acknowledge that there are multiple causes of any human outcome. So if we scroll down to in your lecture outline, you'll see a map. This is a map similar to the one made by Shaw and McKay. It's of Chicago, and you might be wondering why it looks like half of a target. Well, this right-hand part is one of the Great Lakes. You know, Chicago is located on the lake, and so right here in the middle is the center of the target. This is the Central Business District. And in the next zone, they call the transitional zone, and this is where the most recent immigrant groups tended to live. These were the poorest neighborhoods in the city at that time. They had deteriorated housing, factories, abandoned buildings, typical slum conditions. As the new immigrants began to become more economically successful, they would move out of the transitional zone into the next zone, Zone 3, the working class zone. These had single-family tenements. These are cheap apartment buildings, slightly less crime, slightly more functional neighborhoods. And as they got even more economically successful, they moved further out into the residential zone, the suburbs, where you have single-family homes. And then the commuter zone, the farthest out suburbs. So this is what was happening in this early part of the 20th century. Successive waves of immigrants from Southern Europe moving into these neighborhoods in the center city and then gradually moving out. If we look at the next map, okay, This map is actually taken directly from Shaw and McKay's book. And you can see they've got crime rates here. This is actually crime rates measured in terms of juvenile delinquency. And you can see right here in the center they have the biggest numbers, the highest numbers, highest crime rates for juveniles. And those numbers get gradually smaller as you move out towards the suburbs. So this is probably some of the earliest environmental criminology, studying neighborhoods. This leads us into a more contemporary body of theory. Shaw and McKay are not necessarily obsolete, but their approach has been developed and expanded by later criminologists. So we'll move now to social disorganization. I've assigned you some of the main authors in social disorganization theory. Robert Sampson is one of the biggest names. This body of theory is interested in what they call collective efficacy. So efficacy means effectiveness. So your personal efficacy means how effective are you in achieving your goals. Collective efficacy refers to the ability of a neighborhood to come together and collectively achieve certain goals, such as creating a sense of community that is anti-criminogenic. Sampson and the other theorists working in this area define social disorganization as the loss of collective efficacy at the neighborhood level. And one of the main things they're looking at is what criminologists and sociologists call social control, the ability of a society to control its members and to inhibit them from engaging in deviant behavior. Sampson argues that when you have a neighborhood that is low on collective efficacy, they are not effective at social control because primarily of a lack of social trust, a lack of social cohesion, a lack of confidence in the ability of the community to come together to achieve these goals. The things that predict the loss of collective efficacy, in other words, some of the variables that we can look at that might indicate low collective efficacy, are the same things that predict social disorganization: concentrated poverty, lack of home ownership, rundown buildings, family disruptions, a high rate of single-parent households, and so forth. And the lack of social control is the main thing that Sampson is looking at. The idea is that as neighborhoods become disorganized, as they lose their collective efficacy, they are unable to exhibit social control over their members. They cannot exercise social control to inhibit crime. A community that is in flux is culturally fractured. It tends to lack conventional institutions of social control, such as effective families, churches, schools, informal neighborhood clubs, voluntary organizations, and so forth. They tend to be less effective in these neighborhoods. In a situation where social control is low, young people are teenagers and people in their early 20s, at the high crime committing ages, are more free to act on their natural impulses, which are sometimes antisocial and criminogenic. The second way that social disorganization contributes to crime and deviance is a diminished number of positive incentives, or rather, an increased number of positive incentives to engage in crime. So if it's normal in your neighborhood to engage in crime, if there are, for example, drug dealing gangs hiring corner boys to stand out on the street, young people are more liable to fall into this kind of lifestyle. The absence of the pro-social values provided by effective families, churches, neighborhood organizations, these positive incentives to engage in crime are likely to develop and fill in the vacuum. So there can be both negative and positive inducements into crime. Negative incentives such as poverty could be an inducement into crime. Positive incentives could be, for example, the celebration of effective criminals and gang leaders in the neighborhood. So these conditions can be transmitted across generations until they become normal in the neighborhood and part of the neighborhood culture. We'll look at the cultural explanations of crime in a different unit. Now we're basically just focusing on the neighborhood itself, and we'll leave the cultural piece of it for later. So what Shaw and McKay saw back in the 1930s, in the early part of the 20th century, was neighborhoods continually having high crime rates regardless of who was living in those neighborhoods. These findings have been replicated in many urban areas. But it's also interesting to look at the effects in rural areas as well. And what they have found is that the principles of social disorganization still predict crime rates quite well in rural settings. In rural areas where you have low levels of collective efficacy, a lack of social control, a lack of churches, organizations, and so forth to promote pro-social behavior, you will have more high crime rate. What they found, though, is much as in the urban areas, high rates of single-parent households, especially female-headed households, are the strongest predictor of which areas are more likely to have high rates of crime. This body of theory was prominent in criminology well into the 1960s. Became less popular after Robinson's concept of ecological fallacy became the main criticism of him. I always like to provide the criticisms of every theory that we study. Ecological fallacy is to assume that whatever you know to be true about the group is also true about an individual. So if I know that Group A has a high crime rate, if I meet a member of Group A, it's not safe to assume that that individual is a criminal. It may be true that his group is high crime, but I cannot predict that any individual member is a criminal. To do so is the ecological fallacy. Robinson argued that we should not make these inferences about individuals on the basis of group information. And this is a criticism that has been applied to much of social disorganization theory because it focuses on the neighborhood and puts less focus on the individual deviant actors. Closely related to this is Ruth Kornhauser's question: how do we know that the area differences in delinquency rates result from the aggregated characteristics of communities rather than characteristics of individuals? Look, as a kind of a mouthful to say. What she is arguing is that we should focus on the individuals. We should focus on the individual criminal actors. Look at things at the individual level rather than the group level. And you can apply that to ethnic groups as well. For example, some ethnic groups tend to have higher crime rates than others, even when they're living in the same levels of social disorganization or poverty. Moreover, perhaps probably more importantly, the more successful and effective people will leave these dysfunctional neighborhoods and move to neighborhoods where people are more pro-social, leaving behind the more dysfunctional people. So maybe it's not the neighborhoods that's causing the dysfunction. Maybe it's the fact that the less effective individuals are living in these neighborhoods because the people who can get out, who have what it takes to get out to a better neighborhood, have already done so.